The food that we eat influences our brain and influences levels of anxiety much more than we might give it credit for. So when we look at food, it's so easy to think, okay, this is energy. Food is purely energy, but what it does in our brain to influence how we feel is probably one of the biggest things that we can pay attention to. So when you're dealing with anxiety, depression, which is something that I've battled with my entire life, especially when I was very overweight, it was a really rough time. When you understand how much of a problem that is, you'll take any little bit of help that you can get, right? So a lot of times foods that we consume can influence what is called GABA. Now GABA stands for gamma aminobutyric acid. Now what this is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it basically stops excitatory responses in your brain, making you feel calmer. It's a very simple way of putting it. Let's jump right into the foods. Okay, the first one, salmon. You may or may not like salmon, but hear me out on this because I've got some good ones after this either way, okay? There's a study published in the journal Nutrients, took a look at 95 subjects that consumed fatty fish like salmon 3 times per week for 6 months. They compared this to subjects that did the same thing, except instead of eating fatty fish, they ate 3 times per week chicken, pork, or beef, okay? Very simple. They found that fish ended up improving heart rate and improving heart rate variability, but also led to significantly lower subjective anxiety scores. Now, on one hand, I would say, okay, it's subjective anxiety, but it's a pretty decent sample size of people. So even subjective anxiety scores are great. What's interesting is that the heart rate variability improved. Your heart rate variability is the time between strokes, or the variability, kind of how flexible your heart can be with different stressors. So if you get hit with a big ball of stress all of a sudden, the fact that you have variability within your heart rate means that you're able to accommodate that stressor and not kind of really go into a hypoxic state. You can deal with it. The mechanisms here are a little bit unknown, but we can speculate 2 different things. One, vitamin D. Okay, there is a pretty large-scale vitamin D trial that took a look at 7,500 people that found when vitamin D was added into their diet, either supplement or nutritionally, they ended up having significant improvements in their negative emotions, so less negative emotion. So that's a big one. We know vitamin D correlates with that. But the other piece is omega-3s. Okay, the omega-3s in the fatty fish might be modulating that neuroinflammation, the inflammatory effect in the brain that actually can disrupt signaling and kind of skew that glutamate scale to GABA scale. So it may not be the sexiest thing in the world, but it's pretty potent. Now this next one is one that you could add in really easy, okay? And now I'm not even gonna say that you have to cut out coffee and have this in place of it. You could just add it in. Green tea. Now there was a study that was published out of Japan, took a look at over 42,000 Japanese people, and they took a look at their green tea consumption along with sort of their psychological distress. There was a dose-dependent relationship between how much green tea they had and how much psychological distress they had. People that had 5 or more cups of green tea per day had up to 20% lower psychological distress. Now keep in mind, a Japanese cup of green tea is probably a rather smallish cup. It's not like they're having a venti sized cup of green tea 5 times per day. So you could probably get away with maybe 2 or 3 regular American non-Japanese style cups, right? Just decent regular mugs. What's the mechanism here? Number 1, probably theanine. Okay, there's a little bit of caffeine, which you might be thinking that's gonna contribute to anxiety, but not necessarily if the theanine is offsetting it. There was a study that was published in Nutrients that I found very fascinating. They found that theanine reduced the subjective stress to a cognitive stressor. So that means if someone threw a big ball of stress at me, told me that I needed to take a trigonometry test right now or I was gonna lose my house, that would be a big cognitive stressor. Well, theanine can help the subjective perception of that stress. Make it so I'm a little calmer, so maybe I'm not as worried about losing my house, because I suck at trigonometry. Okay, but there's other pieces to the equation too. They also found that theanine reduced cortisol levels 3 hours after consumption, which means long after the caffeine is at its peak, you're still having a lower level of cortisol, meaning that green tea sipping throughout the day might have a carryover effect and actually help you be calmer later in the day. The other piece is, of course, the EGCG. EGCG can help modulate that neuroinflammation as well, so that can help you out in that whole piece. But it also has what are called anti-apoptotic effect, which means it can help preserve cells, keep neuronal cells from dying too early. All this plays a role in how our brain functions. Anyhow, moving on, the next one. Believe it or not, fermented foods, things like kefir, things like kimchi, things like sauerkraut, things like even fermented cheese, other fermented dairy, fermented chocolate. Fermentation seems to do something. It has to do with the gut. Let's dive in. There was a study published in Psychiatry Research, took a look at 710 people. This was super interesting. They had them self-report their levels of neuroticism, their social anxiety, and how much fermented food they ate. Okay, very interesting stuff. Researchers, get this, were able to independently predict who would have more anxiety and neuroticism simply by how much fermented food they ate. What that means is, if they looked at the paper and they saw that someone ate a lot of fermented food, they could independently predict how much anxiety that person would have. They could say, that person probably doesn't have much anxiety, and it would be right. And then if they looked at someone else, they said, okay, Bob did not eat any fermented food. We predict he's gonna have high anxiety. Correct line item, yep, he did have high anxiety. So independent predictor, which is very interesting. Now, what is going on here? Number of different things. I think the biggest piece is diversity of the microbiome is a very blanket thing, right? Okay, you're probably having help there, but also something called galanin. Okay, now galanin is kind of a gut hormone. It's an enteroendocrine, so basically it helps, essentially what it is, it's a peptide that is from what is called an enteroendocrine, so like a hormonal cell in our gut essentially. And when this peptide is controlled, it can affect our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, our HPA axis. This is our fight or flight, our cortisol response, all of that. So interestingly enough, a more diverse microbiome from these fermented foods has an effect on this gut peptide, which is very interesting. Then of course we have to look at the gut-brain axis, right? 95% of the serotonin that we have in our body is produced in the gut. So if the gut is healthy, then we have the serotonin response that helps us feel good, right? And then of course there's just simple gut diversity, having more short-chain fatty acids that can actually help regulate this whole gut-brain axis and have proper communication. Fermented foods are great. Foods that have probiotic effects in terms of, or prebiotic effects I should say, in terms of things like flax, psyllium, chia, other kind of soluble fiber. The occasional probiotic, there's some research with probiotics as well. The one that I use, since people ask all the time, is called Seed. I went ahead, I popped the link down below. So they're cool, they have a capsule inside of a capsule. Really, really cool technology. I'm not a big fan of most probiotics because they usually don't even survive like the hostile gut. Anyway, like once you consume it, the hydrochloric acid in your stomach is just gonna disintegrate it anyway. But they have cool technology with that whole capsule inside of a capsule thing. And talk about gut-brain axis research. They're really on the forefront of that whole gut-brain axis and really trying to look at mental health, which I think is something that doesn't get enough attention these days because it's not super fun to talk about. Anyway, I put a link down below, save you 15% off. It's a symbiotic, so it has a prebiotic and a probiotic in one capsule. So that link down below, Thomas15, saves you 15% off your entire order through them. So if you want to just go ahead and get those probiotics, symbiotics, you can check them out. So it's called Seed, down below in the description. I do recommend you check it out, especially if you're cognizant of everything we're talking about today. So down below in the description. The next one is one that you'll be excited to hear about, and that's chocolate. Dark chocolate specifically. Now there's a study that was published in the journal Nutrients once again, that was really interesting. So they took a look at people that were consuming dark chocolate and they had them sort of self-report their levels of anxiety. And they had them self-report their levels of anxiety an hour after dark chocolate consumption. Well, an hour after dark chocolate consumption, there were definitely lower levels of anxiety. That's pretty cool. But then what they found is even more interesting is later on down the line in a longer tail sort of fashion, people that didn't have high anxiety, that even had low anxiety, still reported lower levels of anxiety. What this tells us is that chocolate does not just work for people that have anxiety. It helps relax people that aren't anxious too, which is probably why you feel good and want to eat more of it, so you have to kind of be careful, right? Very, very interesting stuff. The mechanism here more than likely has to do with flavonols, okay? Because flavonols do have a direct impact on our mood simply because they increase blood flow, cerebral blood flow. It's talking about things like catechins and epicatechins, which increase the blood flow. The more blood flow we have to the brain, the more neurotransmitter function we can potentially have, the more energetics we have in the brain, and the more we can kind of ascertain between good and bad and make better decisions too. The other piece that's very important is simply magnesium. Chocolate is super rich in magnesium if you're getting dark chocolate that does not have a bunch of sugar added to it, okay? The sugar can, arguably counteract this. Magnesium will sit on what is called the NMDA receptor in the brain. This blocks excitatory transmission, meaning you're not having the effect of glutamate. So that glutamatergic response that would normally make you anxious and amped up can't get through because it's blocked. Okay, magnesium sits on the receptor so that can't get through. Thereby, GABA builds up and you're more relaxed. Interestingly enough, they've also found that simply the taste of chocolate can actually calm people down. That's wild. That might just be because chocolate is comfort. Who knows? This next one is super interesting, and you can combine it with green tea, and that's fasting. And I'm not saying this because I like fasting. Well, I am. I wouldn't mention it if I hated fasting, I guess. But the interesting thing is that there's a study that was published in 2021 that took a look at over 1,400 people. Okay, 1,400 people that were into fasting. They found that fasting didn't only decrease anxiety amongst the people that fasted, but also decreased the instances of depression, and also, of course, decreased their weight and their BMI, all without an increase in fatigue. This is interesting because a lot of people think fasting is such a stressor, you're gonna be stressed out. Well, by and large, if you make it a habit, it actually is very helpful. And the speculation is behind it with ketones, more than likely. Ketones have sort of an anti-inflammatory effect that might help you feel a little bit better. They also have some pretty powerful effects on the brain as far as neuroinflammation goes with what's called the NLRP3 inflammasome. So essentially, by attenuating inflammation with that ketone response, perhaps you're feeling better and calmer. There's also something very interesting called the GPR41 receptor. This is in the embryonic stages of research right now, but apparently when this is modulated, it can affect our ability to ascertain stressors properly. So we don't necessarily get stressed out by things that should stress us out. We have this cognitive wherewithal that's happening almost subconsciously with our autonomic nervous system. Very, very fascinating stuff. So combine that with green tea, maybe you get this dual benefit of fasting, ketones, and green tea. Just saying here. Anyhow, as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.